Good morning, and it's very nice to see you all here. Coming first at this conference, I might equally have come last, as it were, in terms of the chronology. I did have to shape and think about the paper in terms of what's to come after. And what I want to do, therefore, is to give us some prompts of wider considerations to think about as we listen to the great expertise over the next 2 or 3 days on particular pictures, on matters technical and physical. And I just wanted to start by reminding us that all our paintings, all the paintings we're going to be looking at, of course, are fundamentally objects. They were once framed or are still framed in their original frames. They may, in the 16th century, have been covered or boxed or in some way concealed from view until particular moments. And therefore, all the painted effects that are used to bring that off, and I'm showing you here just something I looked at again recently. It's the back of the Duccio triptych in Boston with its cover where we are asked to think, is this fake, is this painted as if it's fake marble, or what is it meant to be, what effect has the artist wanted here as early as the 13th century, to show that the way in which painting materials are used to replicate other things on other kinds of surfaces. And I suppose, therefore, what I'm going to just introduce and talk about for the next 20 minutes are those aspects of illusion in paintings that we need to look out for and think about as we listen to the papers in the next 2 or 3 days. I hope to remind us as we listen of about technical analysis, about patronage, of that wider physical context, rolling out the technical competence of these artists whom we largely in this gallery are looking at as portraitists or 1 or 2 narrative pictures, but were also artists who worked on the painted surfaces of buildings and their interiors, and in those instances worked with a great deal of ambition when it came to creating illusory effects. And this issue of the wider, as it were, competence of painters is I think, a very, very important one to us, because I'm showing you here the portrait of Henry VII we have at the Society of Antiquaries, probably about 1501, and about that time when Henry VII's portraiture takes off because of marriage negotiations going on for his children, and later, of course, after 1503 and Elizabeth of York's death himself. And the sort of things that have been discovered about this picture are very interesting in a technical context, because we now know that the wood for this was cut from the same tree as portraits of Arthur and Prince Henry painted at the same time. But also what came up when this was conserved was this framing here of this, what is called in the Making History catalogue, when we exhibited all these pictures at the Royal Academy 3 years ago, the barber pole effect, the royal green and white around this picture, which was only revealed by conservation. Of course, what that reminds us of, more than anything else, is the kind of effect placed on the sorts of things that happened in temporary decoration, or particularly the royal beasts placed on these poles with striped decoration in the royal gardens and in the fences around them, the sort of thing that, as those of you who've been there recently know, has now been reconstructed in the Privy Garden at Hampton Court. So, thinking here of an artist painting a picture with an engaged frame that is then rolled out and used again, it's the same techniques, the same thoughts about decoration and painting that go into other kinds of objects. And that's equally true, we're looking here at a very simple effect when it comes to the making of precious materials. Here we have first of 2 pictures here in the National Portrait Gallery I just want to look at for a moment. The portrait of Nicholas Throckmorton upstairs, oil on panel about 1562, and also the portrait of William Cecil, also from the 1560s, and details of both of these splendid marble columns where we see a degree of marbling and of effect, which is really quite spectacular. What interested me in looking through the MPG's catalogue on that whole group of pictures upstairs at this time with the effects of marble columns is it may or may not be relevant that all these people have recently been travelling, they're aware of continental culture. Throckmorton, of course, sometimes it's been suggested that picture was painted when he was in France. And that this may reflect a signal, not of a particular stylistic influence, but the fact that they are cultured people who have seen such things abroad. And those details, therefore, are very significant, but also, and very much to look out for when we hear the papers to come, the way in which I'm very interested in the way that marble is handled, because when we look at the micro photographs taken here at the gallery, clearly there is a handling of paint and an inventiveness and maybe some ambition in doing new ways of dragging paint across surfaces to create those marble effects from one picture and here from another that's rather different from the very fine quality details of the face and the costume that we see in the rest of the picture. How does that new technical invention, what does it tell us about the painters here, and how is that then used perhaps in other contexts when these artists or people from their workshop worked on other painted surfaces? Another National Portrait Gallery picture is that of Mary Queen of Scots, which we now know from the Dendro chronology dating, dates from somewhere between 1560 and the early 90s. In the conservation of this picture, the inscription of on the right there came to light, as also did the marbling around the frame, giving a different kind of illusion here, a kind of sense of looking through a window with cast light and shadow onto Mary with this effect of a very roughly textured marble that we're looking at. Ideas, again, of illusion. And I want to just go on now for 5 minutes to look at these issues of illusion as we look at them in other kinds of contexts and ask questions about what we think people may have thought they were looking at in the 16th century with these extraordinary illusionistic effects. 5 questions. Question number 1 I'm curious about is whenever I go into the Great Chamber at Hardwick New Hall and I see a series of tapestries where the narrative scenes are roughly the same height as the great plaster frieze above, I ask questions about what people in the by 1600, when these things were in place, thought they were looking at. What was the difference in their eyes between seeing and understanding the woven tapestries and this painted plaster frieze above it? Is it a question that it was felt that one kind of technique was right for one kind of narrative story and another for the other? Is it something to do with how people use the room? But to us as interested historians walking around that room, the degree of illusion that people were asked to understand and come to terms with is something that I think isn't uncomplicated, but also is a great challenge for us to learn and think about. I also want to put up at this point, not the whole thing, I'm afraid the image I was able to get hold of was slightly cropped, as those of you who know this will know, is this by now quite famous picture, because it's been on exhibition in London 2 or 3 times, this small painting on paper of so-called Elizabeth and the Dutch ambassadors, 1570s, possibly as late as 1580, which is always given, and it's still in a German collection, to a Swabian artist of that period. And we might make assumptions here that what we're looking at is a room where Queen Elizabeth is having reception, matted floor, with fixed textile hangings around the walls here. I've always wondered whether, in fact, what we're seeing there through the eyes of this painter isn't, in fact, a painted illusion of textile, as would have been absolutely the case in many of these, in many German castles at this time, and just something, as it were, out of the database somewhere I've been, going around somewhere very close to where the artist is supposed to have come from, Schloss Grunau near Neuburg, a hunting lodge with a spectacular series of painted interiors, including a room like this with, fictive hangings and tassels, the sort of things he would have been used to and possibly is replicating in that picture. But of course, we must also remember there's something else entirely slightly illusionistic about this picture, this event could never have happened, because there in the background, of course, is Mary, Queen of Scots. And as we all know, the Donizetti opera Out With, these two people never met. So the whole concept of the picture is an illusion, but the illusionistic things going on within it are very, very interesting for us to speculate about. The third question, that's a question about the Hardwick Great Chamber, the question about illusion within the painted surface. I just want to turn very briefly now to buildings. Sorry, a not very good slide of a detail of the field of cloth of gold painting in the Royal Collection, where, of course, we know that this, superstructure of this building, put up for the meeting of Francis I and Henry VIII in 1520, was wood, but painted to look like stone and brick. We have accounts for this, and of course we have physical descriptions. And of course we have to work through this painting, which is at least from the 1540s, bearing as it does the Holbein image of Henry. But you know, it's very much a matter of contention when it was actually done. But there, for my purposes, looking at the architecture, about running out these ideas of illusion across buildings, replicating surfaces which are not that of the original material, but giving the effect of something else. And equally, of course, another detail of a painting I showed earlier, the detail of the Henry VIII and his family from the Royal Collection. On the other side of the picture, the figure in one of the Tudor gardens with, on the back wall here, painted decoration. We know, of course, from the enormous amounts of accounts that survive from Elizabeth's reign, that the royal palaces she retained from her father's patrimony were constantly externally repainted with black and white antique work. And George Gower, whom we'll be hearing a paper about later in the conference, of course, sergeant painter, painter of portraits, was paid more than £187 in the year 1582 to 3 for not himself doing it, but organising the decoration, the external decoration of a range of timber buildings at Greenwich. Much of our first investigations of all this, of course, are due to the great Eric Mercer, whose article in the Archaeological Journal is nearly 60 years old now, but describes this painting of the royal palaces under Elizabeth and gives some accounts for that from the National Archives. One of the things that Eric Mercer also raises at the end of his article is something particularly interesting to us. To what extent this replication of all'antica black and white work that we see on the outsides of buildings, in gardens, on wooden structures, painted tombs and funeral monuments of the late 16th century gives way to real black and white. The evidence we have that under James I and Charles I, that the expense of now buying the real materials is beginning to supplant the replication of them. Think, for example, go and look at any of those great late Elizabethan tombs in Westminster Abbey, the Duchess of Sussex, for example, or whatever, and then compare that with the Duke of Buckingham's tomb in black and white marble to see the huge gap there is between one kind of replicated material and using the real thing. My fourth question about illusion is about our needing to understand how illusion can also be allusive. Here is Exeter Town Hall, built with local stones, including stone from Beer in Devon. We now see it today as this rather stripped facade, built about 1590. Again, good accounts for this building. But originally, this was painted with the colours of the city's heraldry. So that what you see here is a stone-built frontispiece to an older medieval great hall, which in itself, by the coloration of the material, shows you something else. It is about the heraldry of the city for which this building was put up. So if we can retrieve some of the original coloristic decoration of such structures of this, we get close to a feeling of not only what these things are illusionistically, but the allusions they make to particular thematic and referential things. The fifth question I would ask about illusion, or point to a way out of illusion, is to do with asking questions of ourselves about what exactly 16th century people thought they were looking at. This is a detail of a piece of painting on canvas in the British Galleries at the V&A. It comes from a house called the Lockers near Hamel Hampstead and has been in the museum for a long time. And it's clearly a piece of canvas which has been painted with oils and various media to suggest the effects of panelling. You have fictive wood here, but you also have a kind of rough tortoiseshell effect around it, and of course a jewel set supposedly in the middle of this panel. And that's a rather imprecise photograph, but to show that this illusion goes on, here's the newer version of it in startling colour that was used for putting on the walls, again in textile, at Shakespeare's birthplace in Stratford-upon-Avon. When I look at this piece of work, what I ask myself is, are people creating this illusion of painted surfaces and materials because you cannot afford the real thing? To have the room really panelled is going to be a lot more expensive than having it painted on canvas very quickly by a competent painter. Or is it something else, I ask myself, particularly at the level of court patrons and people who really have a highly sophisticated knowledge of the visual world and have questions to ask of it? Is it the fact that you know the artist who can replicate this material that is the clever thing to do, that people get the sort of, not exactly the joke, but the point that this isn't the real thing, but you can buy the competence to replicate it, which is really the drive behind this kind of painting. It's not, I think, always just about cheapness. I'd like to give these people the credit of knowing that actually that replication is a rather sophisticated and perhaps, for all we know, quite expensive thing to do. I want to conclude by just taking that world of illusion and painted surfaces into two or three country houses. Because by the late 16th century, or the second half of the 16th century, we are seeing painted illusion on walls, which has been there since the Middle Ages, but certainly taken into areas replicating forms of architecture and contemporary architecture, to note, that haven't been seen before. Here is a detail of Goose Green Farm near Yate in Gloucestershire, and we know a lot about the interior wall painting of this area now, thanks to the splendid book by Catherine Davis on artisan art wall painting in the Welsh Marches. It develops from her PhD thesis on the border counties, and it's a great catalogue of surviving wall paintings from that area, where here we see plaster painted to resemble stone and marble of various colours, but separated, as you can see here, by a dado level, by classical or classicising mouldings, giving a sense of the internal architecture of the room. People thinking, therefore, about the room as they have begun to think about the outsides of buildings, and whenever anything is placed against it or in front of it, it may be taking account of that fictive interior architecture. Here we're at Canons Ashby, the first of two National Trust houses I just want to show you briefly, in the painted parlour created for Sir Erasmus Dryden of the 1590s, painted with the coats of arms of local families. It's interesting to me, coming as I have from work on a great early Tudor house like Vine in Hampshire, where all this is done, the coats of arms are done in carved wood, that by the late 16th century here is somebody doing this in paint on the surface, asking different questions about the way in which we visually perceive these things. And a detail of that, just to show you what that painting looks like, surrounded by these sort of, what are we meant to read this as, kind of inlay or a painted surface that in later years we would have thought of as, you know, inlaid brass or whatever, but painted onto the surface of the picture. And the other house I just want to look at briefly is Little Morton Hall in Cheshire, where we have a room, again, interestingly, a painted parlour, a room where the family sits, painted to look comfortable, again with fictive painted panelling on the walls, painted here directly onto the plaster at Canons Ashby. It's painting on the wooden panelling itself, and giving us a sense here of not just the painted plaster, but also a running scene of narratives along the top here with inscriptions, with the story of Susanna and the elders. Again, a recent very important piece of scholarship on this whole area, Tara Hamling's book, Decorating the Godly Household, has just come out from Yale University Press, talking about what kinds of biblical scenes were permissible after the Reformation within the domestic interior. And I think it's also no accident that both these houses, if we just look back briefly at Canons Ashby here as well, both these houses have inscriptions running along the top, telling us what to think all this is for and what it's about. Something much more prominent in the post-Reformation Protestant households than they would have been originally, but also inscriptions with text bringing us back to our notion of thinking of this as a painted surface. There is illusion on the one hand, but we're reminded that this is a wall surface on which you paint letters at the same time. So the degrees of illusion here through painting are really quite complicated but fascinating for us to think about as we move back towards our easel paintings upstairs, the portable pictures, with their mass of inscriptions. How do we understand them? Why do we read them? How do they help us to think about the visual illusion that's placed before us? And I wanted to end, therefore, back in the gallery itself with the splendid Flicker portrait of Cranmer, because there is no other picture, I think, upstairs greater than this in terms of the range of visual illusions that it presents to us. This is a picture which you can really look at to see not only the replication of a vast range of materials, of books, of inlay, of glass, of the sculptural surround to the window that we're asked to think about here, and Cranmer's clothes, the linens and the velvets that he's wearing, degrees of painted illusion painted with a high degree of technical skill, which really does make us think that it's only through those ranges of illusion and the things he's wearing that we get the allusions to his position as the head of the Reformed English Church, his power, his position, and the sort of life in which the bishops and archbishops of the new church are expected to lead, and the role in which they are playing. Here's a picture, I think, which really does sum up that tremendous range of illusory materials and concepts that I've tried very briefly here this morning to talk to you about. Thank you very much.